Prelude to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the final voyage of Shōkaku. The morning of June 13, 1944, dawned over the quiet anchorage of Tawi-Tawi in the Sulu archipelago, where the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared for what would become one of the defining confrontations of the Pacific War. The humid air shimmered over rows of anchored vessels, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and above all, the carriers that still embodied Japan's fading maritime power. Among them, the fleet carrier Shōkaku stood as both symbol and relic of Japan's early wartime supremacy. Her long steel flight deck, nearly 850 feet from bow to stern, had once launched the aircraft that struck Pearl Harbor 2.5 years earlier, setting the Pacific ablaze. Now she lay poised for her last mission. None of the 1,663 men aboard could have guessed that within a week their ship would lie broken beneath the Philippine Sea, destroyed not by aircraft, but by a submarine stalking her from the depths. 6 days later, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the First Mobile Fleet, stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched as his armada began to move out from Tawi-Tawi's calm waters. The sight was formidable. Ahead steamed 3 fleet carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho, escorted by a powerful screen of cruisers and destroyers. The heavy cruisers Atago, Takao, Maya, and Chokai formed the backbone of the escort, while 13 destroyers fanned out to create a ring of steel around the carriers. This assembly represented the last great concentration of Japanese carrier strength ever to sail into battle. Only 2 years ago, such a fleet had ruled the Pacific from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. Now, it was sailing into a fight that could determine the empire's survival. The operation was not merely another deployment. It was a calculated gamble to reclaim the initiative Japan had steadily lost since Midway. As anchors clanked up through their hawse pipes and the ships began to move into formation, thousands of sailors went to their stations. Few among them realized that more than 1,000 of their number would be dead before another week had passed. Their course lay east, toward the Mariana Islands, where American forces had begun their assault on Saipan. The objective was nothing less than the destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's carrier force, a decisive victory meant to halt the American advance toward Japan's inner defensive perimeter. The broader strategic picture for Japan in mid-1944 was grim. The empire's rapid expansion of 1941–42 had reversed into a slow, inexorable retreat. The Gilbert Islands had fallen, Truk Lagoon had been neutralized, and the invasion of the Marianas threatened to cut the empire in half. The loss of Saipan, in particular, carried immense strategic and psychological weight. From airfields on Saipan, American B-29 Superfortress bombers would be able to strike Tokyo directly, bringing the war home to the Japanese capital for the first time since the symbolic Doolittle raid of 1942. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, grasped the magnitude of the crisis with complete clarity. If the Marianas were lost, Japan would not only forfeit its forward defense line, it would also lose vital communication routes to its southern territories, rich in oil and raw materials. To prevent this, Toyota authorized Operation Ago, a last-ditch plan built upon Japan's remaining perceived strengths, the superior range of its carrier-based aircraft, the support of land-based air units positioned across the Marianas and Palau, and the highly trained gunnery of its surface fleet, which still considered the best in night fighting. The concept was straightforward in design, but desperate in execution. Ozawa's mobile fleet would strike the American carriers when they were preoccupied supporting the Saipan landings. Land-based aircraft would weaken the U.S. formations before the carrier force delivered the decisive blow. In theory, it was a resurrection of the grand, decisive battle doctrine that had guided Japanese naval thought for decades. In practice, however, the Japan that sailed from Tawi-Tawi in 1944 was a shadow of the Navy that had once shocked the world at Pearl Harbor. The most serious weakness lay not in ships or weapons, but in people. Years of attritional warfare in the Solomons and the Central Pacific had gutted the elite corps of carrier pilots who once executed precision strikes across half the Pacific. Those veterans, men who had honed their craft in the skies over Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon, were gone, lost in the costly battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Santa Cruz Islands. Their replacements, trained hastily in compressed programs, lacked both experience and tactical judgment. Many had logged fewer than 200 flight hours, barely a quarter of the experience of the average American naval aviator by 1944. The imbalance in skill would prove catastrophic in the battles to come. Even Japan's superb aircraft designs could not compensate for the loss of the pilots who once flew them. As Shōkaku's engines thundered to life and her escort destroyers took position off her flanks, the fleet's sailors could not know that they were participating in the twilight of Japan's carrier arm. The operation ahead would culminate in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a confrontation remembered not only for the loss of Japan's remaining carriers, but for the tragic end of the proud vessel whose aircraft had once brought war to America's shores. By mid-1944, the Japanese Navy faced a crisis that reached far beyond its dwindling numbers of trained pilots. A far more immediate threat lay hidden in the fuel tanks of its ships. The Empire's merchant fleet, once the vital artery connecting the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia with the home islands, had been all but destroyed by the relentless campaign of American submarines. The undersea war had crippled Japan's ability to move refined petroleum from the East Indies, forcing the fleet to rely on raw, unprocessed crude drawn directly from the wells of Tarakan in Borneo. This crude oil was heavy, sulfur-laden, and ill-suited for warships designed to burn refined fuel. When pumped into the bunkers of the carriers and battleships, it produced dense, sooty exhaust that betrayed the fleet's position and fouled machinery. The thick smoke hung over the sea like a black shroud, and the cloying fumes permeated every passageway. In the engine rooms, sailors endured unbearable heat and choking air as the toxic vapors from burning crude filled the compartments, turning routine watch shifts into exercises in endurance. The fuel shortage, once a logistical inconvenience, had now become a combat liability. Despite these grim conditions, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Osawa's fleet, known officially as the First Mobile Fleet, remained a formidable fighting force, at least on paper. His combined squadrons comprised 9 aircraft carriers carrying roughly 440 planes supported by 5 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, alongside 13 cruisers and 28 destroyers. Arrayed against them stood Admiral Raymond Spruance's U.S. Fifth Fleet, which dwarfed its opponent with 15 carriers, 956 aircraft, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The Americans possessed not only greater numbers, but also the edge in technology, radar coordination, and the invaluable experience of well-trained air crews. Osawa, however, believed that with cunning and precision, those advantages could be neutralized. His plan hinged on exploiting 2 remaining Japanese strengths: the superior range of their aircraft and the strategic element of surprise. Japanese intelligence accurately deduced that the Marianas would be the next major American objective, giving Osawa the rare opportunity to position his forces for an ambush. His battle plan, conceived with methodical clarity, aimed to keep his carriers outside the striking distance of American aircraft, while using his own long-range planes to deliver the first blow. Unlike the sturdier American aircraft, Japanese carrier planes had been stripped of protective armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to extend their operational reach. They could strike from distances approaching 300 miles, nearly 100 more than U.S. carrier bombers and torpedo planes. Osawa also intended to augment his offensive with the support of more than 500 land-based aircraft stationed on Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Yap. These land-based squadrons would soften the American fleet with preliminary strikes, whereupon his carrier air groups would deliver the decisive follow-up attack. In theory, this coordinated assault would saturate American defenses and open the way for a major victory. For the coming engagement, Osawa divided his fleet into three primary elements. The van force, under Vice Admiral Takao Kurita, consisted of the light carriers that would act as forward screens. The main force, commanded by Osawa himself from his flagship Taiho, included Shokaku and Zuikaku. Finally, Force B, under Rear Admiral Takagi Joshima, comprised the remaining carriers. The intention was to create overlapping attack waves that could strike simultaneously from multiple directions, complicating the American response.
Across the sea, Admiral Spruance faced an unenviable balancing act. His Fifth Fleet had two competing priorities: safeguarding the invasion of Saipan and neutralizing any attempt by the Japanese to disrupt it. Although Allied codebreakers and coast watchers had confirmed that a major Japanese task force was moving eastward, the precise makeup and intentions of the enemy remained uncertain. Spruance deployed Task Force 58, divided into 4 carrier groups west of the Marianas, to form a defensive wall between Osawa's approaching fleet and the amphibious forces landing on Saipan's beaches. Meanwhile, another crucial element was quietly taking shape beneath the waves. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. Submarine Force in the Pacific, had long studied Japanese naval behavior and predicted that any large-scale relief effort would have to pass through the Philippine Sea. Acting on this insight, he ordered a network of submarines to establish what he termed the NA Line, a dispersed formation of patrol zones designed to serve as an early warning screen. Submarines such as Albacore, Bang, Finback, and Stingray took up carefully plotted positions, forming a hidden net across the anticipated route of the Japanese fleet. However, destiny would favor an unexpected participant. One submarine not originally part of Lockwood's precise arrangement was about to make history. The USS Cavalla, SS-244, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, had been assigned to patrol waters east of the Philippines during her first war cruise. But as operational circumstances shifted, Kossler's vessel found itself directly in the path of Osawa's advancing armada. Sleek, fast, and equipped with the latest sonar and torpedo technology, Cavalla represented the cutting edge of American submarine design in 1944, and she was about to play a pivotal role in one of the most dramatic encounters of the Pacific War. The USS Cavalla emerged from the slips of the Electric Boat Company's shipyard in Groton, Connecticut, a product of America's most advanced wartime engineering. She was a Gatto-class fleet submarine, one of 77 boats of her type that would ultimately form the operational backbone of the United States undersea arm during the Second World War. Her keel had been laid on March 4, 1943, and by November 14th of the same year, the newly constructed vessel slid down the ways into the Thames River. After months of fitting out and testing, Cavalla was formally commissioned on February 29, 1944, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, a 36-year-old career submariner from Ohio and graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy's class of 1930. Stretching 311 feet 9 inches from bow to stern and displacing 1,526 tons on the surface, Cavalla represented a blend of endurance, speed, and stealth. Her pressure hull, built from high-tensile steel, was rated for a test depth of 300 feet, though in emergencies it could withstand pressures approaching 400. 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines provided 5,400 horsepower when surfaced, driving the generators that charged her massive battery banks. Once submerged, 4 General Electric motors supplied propulsion, producing 2,740 horsepower and giving the submarine a top speed of 8.75 knots underwater at over 20 knots on the surface. Her endurance was equally impressive. She could cover 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots without refueling. Those submerged operations were limited to about 48 hours at 2 knots before the batteries required recharging. Her armament reflected the evolution of American submarine warfare. The boat mounted 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, capable of launching a total of 24 torpedoes, typically the improved Mark 14 or Mark 18 types. Each Mark 14 was a formidable weapon in its own right. 20 feet 6 inches long, 3,280 pounds in weight, and carrying a 643-pound Torpex warhead, powerful enough to cripple any ship short of a battleship. Earlier in the war, these torpedoes had suffered from design flaws, faulty magnetic exploders, and depth control problems. But by 1944, those defects had been largely corrected, making them far more dependable in combat. For surface engagements or defensive action, Cavalla carried a 5-inch, 25-caliber deck gun supplied with 200 rounds, along with .5-caliber machine guns for anti-aircraft defense. Aboard her steel hull lived a crew of 72 men, a close-knit company of officers and enlisted sailors who had spent 3 months in rigorous training before embarking on their first war patrol. Life on a submarine was unlike any other assignment in the Navy. Confined spaces, constant noise, and the ever-present awareness of the sea pressing against the hull created an atmosphere where cooperation and technical precision meant survival. Every man, from the captain to the youngest seaman, was required to qualify on all critical systems, from trim tanks and diving planes to torpedo controls and electrical panels. In an emergency, anyone might be called upon to perform another's duty without hesitation.
Technologically, Cavalla embodied the most sophisticated systems available to American submarines in 1944. Her SJ surface search radar could detect ships at ranges up to 12 miles under ideal conditions, while the SD air search radar offered early warning of enemy aircraft. For attack approaches, an ST periscope-mounted radar provided accurate range data, although it demanded constant calibration. Below the surface, her JK passive sonar array tracked contacts acoustically, a system primitive by later standards but invaluable for the period. At the core of the fire control system was the Torpedo Data Computer, TDC, a complex electromechanical analog brain that continually solved for target range, bearing, speed, and course, integrating these with the submarine's own motion to generate precise firing solutions. USS Cavalla's journey to wartime service began in earnest on June 4, 1944, when she sailed from Midway Island on her first combat patrol. The voyage that brought her there had already been long and demanding. After commissioning, the submarine had traveled 5,000 miles from Connecticut through the Panama Canal, arriving at Pearl Harbor in mid-May for final outfitting. From there, she proceeded to Midway, where the crew conducted last-minute inspections, took on fresh provisions, and received their final operational briefings. The atoll offered few comforts, little more than a refueling stop and a scattering of Quonset huts, but it marked the threshold between training and the unforgiving reality of war. Kossler's assigned patrol sector lay to the east of the Philippines, covering the approaches to the San Bernardino and Surigao Straits, two vital sea lanes that linked Japan's industrial heartland with the resource territories of the Netherlands East Indies. These waters served as lifelines for oil, ore, and supplies bound for the home islands, and American command wanted them disrupted. Kossler's orders were clear: intercept and destroy enemy shipping, collect intelligence on naval traffic, and report on any major fleet movements that might indicate Japanese plans to counter U.S. operations in the Marianas. The early days of the patrol passed uneventfully as Cavalla pushed westward across the endless Pacific expanse. Life aboard settled into the rhythm familiar to all submariners:
4 hours on watch, 8 hours off, with rest, maintenance, and training filling every spare moment. Meals were simple but hearty. Bunks were hot-bunked among crewmen, and the constant hum of machinery served as a reminder that beneath the calm sea stretched a fragile envelope of steel separating them from crushing pressure. Few aboard could have guessed that within days, their quiet patrol would place them directly in the path of the largest carrier fleet Japan would ever assemble, and that Cavalla would write her name into the history of submarine warfare. During the long nights of her westward voyage, USS Cavalla cruised on the surface, her 4 Fairbanks Morse diesels roaring steadily as they pushed the submarine toward her patrol zone and replenished the vast banks of batteries that would later sustain her underwater. By day, she became a creature of stealth, diving beneath the waves to evade the vigilant eyes of enemy patrol aircraft. Submerged operations were deliberately slow and methodical, seldom exceeding 3 knots. A pace dictated by the need to conserve precious electrical power. The routine of stealth and endurance continued until June 8, 1944, when a brief but curious event broke the monotony. While transiting roughly 1,200 miles southeast of Tokyo, in the open waters near Marcus Island, the officer of the deck suddenly reported a violent shudder through the hull, followed by a noticeable vibration aft. Moments later, lookouts noted what seemed to be a reddish stain spreading through the submarine's wake. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, suspecting possible mechanical trouble, immediately ordered all stop. A damage inspection revealed no harm to the propellers or stern planes. With no other explanation evident, Kossler concluded they had likely collided with a small whale, a not uncommon hazard in the Central Pacific. The strange encounter served as a sober reminder that the sea itself could be as unpredictable as any enemy.
By June 14, Cavalla began to feel the full force of the Pacific's temper. The barometer fell sharply, the wind freshened, and by afternoon, the waves were cresting at 15 feet. Heavy seas battered the bridge, sending cascades of water down through the conning tower hatch and flooding the control room. The submarine rolled violently, knocking sailors from their bunks and turning routine tasks into ordeals. Crackery shattered in the galley, tools clattered loose in the engine room, and several crewmen succumbed to severe seasickness. Kossler attempted to send a weather transmission to Pearl Harbor, information vital to fleet meteorologists tracking storm systems that could affect upcoming air operations, but the pounding surf and static interference rendered communication impossible. After nearly 18 hours of futile struggle on the surface, he made the pragmatic decision to take the boat down. Submerged at depth, Cavalla rode out the remainder of the storm in relative stability, her motion dampened by the ocean's calm below the turbulence. When she surfaced again on June 15, the skies had cleared, and the seas were finally moderating. It was then that the submarine's radio operator intercepted a contact report from USS Flying Fish, another American boat operating nearby. The message electrified the crew. Flying Fish had sighted a formation of Japanese warships heading east at high speed, but had been unable to reach firing range. The implication was unmistakable. Major enemy fleet units were moving through the area. For submarine crews who'd spent years hunting isolated freighters and small convoys, the prospect of encountering capital ships was exhilarating. Kossler wasted no time. He ordered a sharp course change to intercept the reported contact and advance speed to 17 knots, driving the diesel engines to their limits despite the still rough sea state. En route, Cavalla made radio contact with USS Pipefish, which had also picked up Flying Fish's transmission. The two commanders quickly coordinated a joint search plan, agreeing to sweep parallel tracks spaced roughly 20 miles apart, thereby maximizing their chances of locating the Japanese force. Through the long night of June 15-16, Cavalla's lookouts scanned the horizon for the faintest hint of silhouettes against the starlit sky. While inside the conning tower, the radar operator methodically swept the SJ scope,
searching for telltale blips that might signal the presence of enemy ships. The hours dragged on without result. When dawn broke over a calm Pacific, the horizon remained empty. Despite covering more than 200 miles, the coordinated sweep had failed to find the enemy. By late morning, Kossler reluctantly concluded that the Japanese task force had altered course or increased speed beyond what his intercept plan allowed. With fuel and provisions to consider, he ordered Cavalla back toward her assigned patrol sector. Yet, even in disappointment, morale remained high. The men now knew that a major Japanese fleet movement was underway, an unmistakable prelude to a significant naval engagement. Shortly before midnight on June 16, Cavalla's radar operator reported multiple contacts to the southwest. The display showed 5 or 6 distinct pips moving at a moderate speed on a steady course. Kossler hurried to the conning tower and studied the screen. The radar return suggested a convoy formation, 2 large targets, perhaps oilers or transports, accompanied by several smaller ones, likely to be destroyers. This was the kind of target submarines were built to destroy. Without hesitation, Kossler ordered battle stations and began the careful maneuvering of an attack approach. But the engagement quickly turned into a tense game of cat and mouse. The Japanese escorts were alert and well-trained, their sonar operators sweeping aggressively with active pinging, and their ships executing unpredictable course changes. Each time Cavalla crept into what seemed a favorable firing position, a destroyer would abruptly turn toward her, forcing Kossler to dive deep and rig for silence. For more than 3 exhausting hours, the submarine shadowed the enemy without closing in within 4,000 yards of the main targets. Finally, one of the escorts charged directly toward Cavalla's position. Kossler ordered an emergency dive to 300 feet, shutting down non-essential systems to minimize noise. The destroyer's propellers thundered overhead, the sound reverberating through the hull, but no depth charges followed. When the sub finally surfaced around 0200 on June 17, the radar screen was blank. The convoy had vanished into the night.
Though disappointed, Kossler took the failure philosophically. Encounters like this were part of the unpredictable rhythm of undersea warfare, where opportunity and frustration often arrived in equal measure. What he could not have known was that the formation he had nearly intercepted consisted of fleet oilers assigned to refuel Vice Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet. A successful strike that night might have left the Japanese carriers crippled by fuel shortages and unable to launch their next major operation. History, however, would turn on what didn't happen as much as what did. Later that same day, June 17, new instructions arrived from Commander Submarine Pacific, or COMSUB-PAC, headquarters. Drawing on intelligence from multiple submarine reports and intercepted Japanese communications, Admiral Charles Lockwood ordered a repositioning of his boats. It was now evident that a large enemy naval force was moving eastward, an unmistakable sign that the decisive fleet battle of the Philippine Sea was approaching. Cavalla would soon find herself in its path. The orders from headquarters reached USS Cavalla on the afternoon of June 17, 1944. She was instructed to move to latitude 13 degrees 00 minutes north, longitude 13 degrees 00 minutes east, a position roughly 350 miles west of Guam, where she was to lie in wait for what intelligence believed to be an approaching Japanese fleet. Commander Herman Kossler spread the navigation charts across the chart table, traced the coordinates, and gave the helm new bearings. The submarine came about, engine straining as she drove hard toward the designated intercept point. At 1945 hours, while the boat surged through the gathering dusk, the SJ radar operator reported a faint echo to the northwest, bearing 290 degrees, range 30,000 yards. The contact appeared only intermittently, fading in and out with each sweep of the antenna, a sure sign that it lay near the outer edge of radar range. Kossler immediately adjusted course to close the contact and ordered maximum speed. As the distance narrowed, additional echoes began to bloom on the scope.
2, then 4, then 7 distinct returns. By 2015, the picture was unmistakable. The cluster of radar pips represented a large formation of heavy ships advancing at 19 knots on a northeast course of 045 degrees, weaving slightly in a textbook anti-submarine zigzag pattern. Plotting the movement, Kossler and his exec concluded that the force was headed toward the Marianas. The radar profile suggested a major task group, at least one aircraft carrier, several battleships or heavy cruisers, and an escort screen of destroyers. This was no merchant convoy. Cavalla had stumbled into the path of a principal element of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. Kossler now faced one of the hardest decisions a submarine commander could confront. The enemy was within reach, moving into a perfect attack position. A well-timed torpedo spread could cripple or even sink one of Japan's capital ships. Yet he also knew the value of what he had found. The location, heading, and speed of this fleet were of immense strategic importance. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, needed this intelligence more than it needed one submarine's isolated success. After a short consultation with his executive officer, Kossler made his choice. He would forego the attack and risk surfacing to send a contact report, a move that defied every instinct of stealth that submarine service had drilled into him. When darkness had fully settled and the Japanese force was safely beyond visual range, Cavalla broke the surface at 21:45 hours. The tropical night was moonless, humid, and perfectly still. The radio operator went to work immediately, keying out the urgent message on the fleet frequency.
Large enemy task force. Latitude 13 degrees north. Longitude 136 degrees 30 minutes east. Course 045 degrees. Speed 19 knots. Composition: 1 carrier, several battleships or cruisers, multiple destroyers. The signal raced across the Pacific, received first at Pearl Harbor and then relayed directly to Admiral Spruance aboard USS Indianapolis. Within minutes, Spruance had confirmation that the long-anticipated Japanese carrier fleet was indeed advancing toward the American invasion force near the Marianas. Cavalla's transmission effectively opened the Battle of the Philippine Sea, though her crew could not yet know it. After acknowledgement of receipt, Cavalla submerged once more and tried to regain contact with the Japanese ships. For hours, she ran at full submerged power, chasing faint echoes across the dark Pacific. But the Japanese fleet, steaming at high speed, gradually slipped beyond reach. By dawn on June 18th, Kossler reluctantly called off the pursuit and returned to his patrol station. Though the men were disappointed at missing their chance to fire torpedoes, the captain assured them that their message had likely been of far greater consequence than any single attack could have achieved. He was right, and the crew's true test was still ahead. That day, Cavalla lay quiet beneath the waves, surfacing only after nightfall to ventilate the boat, recharge batteries, and copy new radio traffic. Across the Pacific ether, the air buzzed with encrypted transmissions as both American and Japanese fleets maneuvered toward their confrontation. Kossler sensed that a decisive engagement was forming, but the submarine had no clear picture of the vast chessboard on which it played its part. The standing order remained unchanged: maintain position and strike any enemy force that crossed into the patrol zone. Through June 18th, routine maintenance filled the hours. Torpedo tubes were checked, engines tuned, and every man reviewed battle procedures. The calm before the storm ended abruptly at 0345 on June 19th, when a low-flying aircraft roared overhead. The officer of the deck sounded the alarm instantly, and Cavalla crash-dived. Water surged through the hull as ballast tanks flooded, the bow angling sharply downward. The crew braced for the thud of depth bombs, but none came. Either the aircraft had not seen them in the pre-dawn darkness, or it lacked the ordnance to attack. After 30 tense minutes at depth, Kossler brought the boat back up to periscope level. Dawn was breaking over a calm sea. The men could not know it yet, but fate had placed them squarely in the path of Ozawa's main carrier striking force. Believing himself undiscovered, Osawa had already launched his first wave of aircraft against the U.S. carrier task groups at 0830. As those planes departed, his carriers turned into the wind to recover their returning fighters and ready the next launch. At 10:48, Cavalla's sonar room came alive with a report of high-speed propeller beats bearing 070 degrees. Kossler lifted the periscope for a brief glance, then quickly dropped it. On the far horizon stood the unmistakable pagoda-style masts of Japanese warships. He ordered battle stations submerged, and the interior of the submarine transformed in seconds. Men slid into their stations, the torpedo crew ran final checks, and the plotting team began developing firing solutions. At 10:52, Kossler took a second look through the scope. What he saw froze him for a moment. The massive outline of a Japanese aircraft carrier accompanied by a heavy cruiser and several destroyers, steaming in from the northeast at approximately 20 knots. Aircraft circled above, waiting to land. The carrier's flight deck was crowded with recovered planes, wings still unfolded from their recent missions. Kossler estimated the range at 12,000 yards, too far for a reliable torpedo shot, but the enemy's course would soon bring them much closer. The next quarter hour would demand from Lieutenant Commander Kossler and his crew a degree of precision and nerve few submariners would ever face. To achieve an effective firing position without betraying Cavalla's presence to the vigilant destroyer screen required a balance of audacity and restraint. Every maneuver had to be calculated in silence, every decision made within seconds. Through the periscope, raised only in fleeting intervals, Kossler could glimpse the imposing outlines of the Japanese formation. Each sighting was perilous. Enemy lookouts were actively scanning for submarine periscopes, and one glint of sunlight could expose their location. Inside the control room, the target data computer operator continuously refined the firing solution, integrating bearings from sonar and the commander's brief visual confirmations. The rhythmic hum of machinery mixed with whispered calculations and the soft clicks of plotting pencils. From these glimpses and sound patterns, it became evident that the leading vessel was one of Japan's formidable Shokaku-class aircraft carriers. Recognizable by its offset island superstructure to starboard, a broad armored flight deck, and its dense arrangement of anti-aircraft mounts. By 11:10 a.m., Kossler made what he intended as his final periscope check before the attack. The carrier, now positively identified as either Shōkaku or Zuikaku, was drawing nearer, presenting an ideal angle for a full broadside strike at roughly 5,000 yards, and closing fast. However, the destroyer Urikaze had drifted into a protective position off the carrier's flank, directly across the projected torpedo track. In that tense moment, Kossler faced one of the defining decisions of submarine command: to wait and risk losing the perfect angle, or to fire immediately and trust that luck and timing would favor them. At precisely 11:18, with the range closing to just over 1,200 yards, Kossler made his choice. "Fire one," he ordered calmly. The first torpedo left its tube with a muffled shudder, followed at 8-second intervals by 5 more. The 6 weapons spread outward in a carefully calculated fan designed to ensure at least several hits even if the target attempted evasive action. Each torpedo was set to run at 15 feet, shallow enough to strike vital compartments above the armored belt, but deep enough to avoid premature detonation in surface turbulence. Inside the control room, the target data computer operator continuously refined the firing solution, integrating bearings from sonar and the commander's brief visual confirmations. The rhythmic hum of machinery mixed with whispered calculations and the soft clicks of plotting pencils. Even before the last torpedo had cleared its tube, Kossler gave the next order: "Take her deep, flood negative, full dive on the bow planes." Cavalla's nose tilted sharply downward as water rushed into her ballast tanks, driving the boat below periscope depth. At 100 feet,
The crew waited tensely for the result. The first explosion came, a deep, concussive thud that reverberated through the steel hull. Then another, and then another. 3 detonations in all, evenly spaced, each followed by a momentary stillness that was almost more unnerving than the blasts themselves. The crew exchanged restrained grins. 3 solid hits on a maneuvering carrier was a triumph few submariners would ever claim.
On the Japanese carrier Shokaku, the disaster unfolded within seconds. A lookout's frantic warning of torpedo wakes came too late. The officer of the watch ordered full right rudder and emergency speed, but the turn barely began before the first impact tore into the starboard midsection near frame 145. The detonation ripped open the hull plating and flooded boiler room number 3. Moments later, a second torpedo struck forward, igniting aviation fuel tanks and engulfing the hangar deck in flames. The third hit near the forward aircraft elevator, jamming it in the raise position and halting flight operations altogether. Smoke rolled across the deck as burning aviation gasoline cascaded into lower compartments. The carrier began listing heavily to starboard. Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, realizing the severity of the flooding, ordered counter-flooding to stabilize the ship. The measure reduced the list but also sacrificed critical buoyancy. Within minutes, Shōkaku's speed dropped to 12 knots, her engine struggling against the rising weight of water. Aboard Cavalla, the sense of accomplishment evaporated almost instantly as the first depth charges detonated behind them, 2 minutes after the attack. The Japanese escorts had reacted swiftly, tracing either the torpedo wakes or the submarine's periscope location. What followed was 2 hours of relentless pursuit. Depth charges fell in carefully coordinated patterns, creating expanding spheres of destruction that battered the sea around Cavalla. The submarine descended to 300 feet, close to her test depth, while her hull creaked under the mounting pressure. Cork insulation and dust drifted from overhead as the concussion slammed through the interior. Kossler ordered silent running. All unnecessary equipment was shut down. The crew moved barefoot to avoid any metallic clatter. The temperature rose rapidly as air circulation ceased, and within minutes the submarine felt like an oven. Men stood drenched in sweat, barely breathing, listening for the next explosion. At 11:44 hours, the sonar operator reported a destroyer directly overhead. The low, rhythmic beat of propellers grew louder until it seemed to vibrate through the deck plates. Every man held his breath, expecting another barrage. Then silence. No explosions followed. Whether the destroyer had lost contact or was repositioning for a new attack was impossible to know. Sensing a fleeting chance, Kossler ordered a subtle course change and adjusted depth using temperature layers in the ocean to disrupt enemy sonar detection. Over the next 2 hours, Cavalla weaved her way through the depths, altering course every few minutes. The explosions grew more distant, less frequent. By 1300 hours, the sonar operator reported that only one destroyer remained close by. The others had apparently broken off to assist the crippled carrier. Then, at 1332, faint, irregular noises began echoing through the hydrophones, cracking, rumbling sounds that only seasoned submariners recognized. The operator turned to Kossler, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's breaking up, sir." For the next half hour, faint but unmistakable noises drifted through Cavalla's hydrophones, deep groaning cracks followed by sharp reports. To experienced ears, they could only mean one thing: a ship's hull was giving way under stress. The sounds came and went, uneven and haunting, as if Shōkaku herself were struggling against the sea that was slowly consuming her.
Then, at 1408 hours, a sequence of massive detonations rolled through the water. Even at Cavalla's distance, the pressure waves thudded against her hull. These were no mere depth charges. The magnitude suggested the catastrophic ignition of Shōkaku's magazines or aviation fuel reserves. Aboard the stricken carrier, the crew's desperate fight for survival had entered its final stage. At first, the damage control teams had shown remarkable discipline, sealing off flooded compartments and bringing some fires under control. Yet the torpedo hits had inflicted wounds no crew could hope to mend. Vital pipelines had ruptured, ventilation systems were in ruins, and seawater mingled with volatile aviation fuel throughout the lower decks. The carrier had become a floating time bomb. Despite constant efforts to purge the fumes, gasoline vapors, heavier than air, pooled in the ship's lowest compartments. Sometime around 1400 hours, a single spark, perhaps from damaged wiring, perhaps from hot debris, triggered the inevitable. The explosion tore through Shōkaku's interior like a hammer blow. The armored flight deck heaved upward, lifting aircraft, equipment, and men into the air. The blast ruptured bulkheads and extinguished the last hope of saving the vessel. Secondary detonations followed as ready-use ammunition ignited, feeding a chain of fires that raced from bow to stern. Recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, Captain Matsubara Hiroshi gave the order to abandon ship at 1410 hours. By then, many compartments were already unreachable, cut off by fire, flooding, or twisted wreckage. The great carrier began to roll to starboard, her deck now sloping at a 45-degree angle. Men clung to railings or slid helplessly down the burning deck into the sea, fighting the suction as the vessel's stern began to sink. Nearby, the destroyer Urakaz and the light cruiser Yahagi moved in under the shadow of the carrier's death throes, throwing life rings and ropes to the struggling survivors. At 15:01, Shōkaku gave a final shudder, rolled completely onto her side, and slipped beneath the surface stern first. As she disappeared, further explosions rumbled from within, likely the ship's boilers bursting as they met cold seawater, or the detonation of remaining ordnance. Thus ended the career of one of Japan's most famous fleet carriers, veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and countless other engagements. Out of a complement of 1,663 officers and men, only about 570 were pulled from the water. Captain Matsubara remained aboard, choosing to go down with his ship. Over 1,200 of her crew perished. The consequences of Shōkaku's destruction rippled far beyond the immediate loss. On that same day, the carrier Taiho had also been sunk by the submarine Albacore. In a single afternoon, 2 of Japan's 3 remaining fleet carriers were gone, along with hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and trained aviators. Japanese naval air power, already weakened by attrition, suffered a blow from which it would never recover. The date, June 19, 1944, would enter American history under a new name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Meanwhile, deep beneath the waves, Cavalla's situation was becoming dire. Her batteries were nearly depleted, and the air had grown thick with carbon dioxide. The crew's movements had slowed. Every breath felt heavy. Recognizing the limits of endurance, Kossler ordered the submarine to ascend to periscope depth, fully aware that enemy destroyers might still be prowling nearby. To his relief, the lens showed only empty sea. The Japanese escorts had withdrawn, either to recover survivors or to rejoin what remained of Admiral Ozawa's shattered fleet. At 1900 hours, after more than 7 exhausting hours submerged, Cavalla broke the surface. The hatches opened to the warm twilight of the Philippine Sea, and a rush of clean, salty air flooded the boat. Men climbed to the bridge, gasping for breath and letting the sea spray wash the sweat from their faces. The diesel engines were started, recharging the nearly drained batteries and forcing cool air back into the stifling compartments below. Gradually, the temperature inside dropped from its earlier furnace-like 125 degrees, and normal conditions were restored. Kossler's immediate priority was communication. The radio operator transmitted a brief but momentous message. Attacked Shōkaku-class carrier. 3 confirmed hits. Heavy explosions heard. Target believed sunk. Position 11 degrees 50 north, 137 degrees 57 east. At Pearl Harbor, the report caused jubilation. Admiral Charles Lockwood, head of the U.S. Submarine Force, personally sent the reply. "Outstanding work, Cavalla. Your success exceeds all expectations." Cavalla's patrol continued for another 6 weeks, though nothing would compare to that fateful day in June. When she finally entered Saipan on July 1st, the island was still echoing with gunfire and smoke from the recently won battle. Hundreds of ships filled the harbor, evidence of the vast scale of the American advance. Staff officers from Admiral Spruan's and Turner's commands came aboard to congratulate Kossler and debrief his crew in person. Only then did the submariners learn the full scope of their accomplishment. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had annihilated Japan's carrier aviation. 3 carriers lost, over 600 aircraft destroyed, and the cream of the Imperial Navy's aviators gone. The once formidable mobile fleet had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The war in the Pacific would continue for another 14 months, but Japan's strategic fate was already sealed. The sinking of Shōkaku was more than the destruction of a warship. It marked the symbolic end of Japan's offensive power at sea and the irreversible shift of naval dominance to the United States. The aircraft carrier that had once spearheaded the assault on Pearl Harbor, an icon of Japan's early wartime dominance, ultimately met her end beneath the Pacific, struck down by a submarine from the very nation she had helped thrust into war. The historical irony of her destruction was unmistakable. When the details of Shōkaku's loss finally became public after the war, both naval historians and the American public recognized the poetic justice embedded in the event. For USS Cavalla, the submarine responsible, that single engagement secured an enduring place in naval history. Her first war patrol, which culminated in the sinking of one of Japan's proudest fleet carriers, marked her as one of the most successful boats in the Pacific Fleet. Over the remainder of the conflict, Cavalla would complete 5 additional patrols and claim 3 more Japanese ships. While accounts vary regarding the exact tonnage of her subsequent victories, none equaled the significance of the salvo she unleashed on June 19, 1944.
Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kossler, Cavalla's commanding officer, received the Navy Cross for his leadership and composure under pressure. The submarine herself was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for the exceptional execution of her maiden mission. Yet the importance of Cavalla's achievement can only be fully understood when viewed against the broader campaign waged by America's undersea fleet. Although submariners represented less than 2% of U.S. Navy personnel, their impact on Japan's maritime war effort was devastating. They accounted for roughly 55% of all Japanese ship losses. By war's end, American submarines had destroyed over 2,000 enemy warships, totaling more than 500,000 tons, along with more than 1,000 merchant vessels, nearly 5 million tons of shipping erased from Japan's supply lines. This campaign of attrition effectively strangled the Japanese Empire. The islands that had once been bound together by ocean highways became isolated outposts, starved of oil, food, and reinforcements. While dramatic sinkings of capital ships like Shōkaku captured headlines, it was the relentless destruction of Japan's merchant fleet that ultimately proved decisive. From a tactical perspective, Cavalla's encounter with Shōkaku reshaped U.S. submarine doctrine. Kossler's choice to transmit an early contact report before launching his attack highlighted the submarine's dual role as both a hunter and a vital source of reconnaissance for the fleet. His careful approach, surfacing only 3 times to take periscope readings before firing, became a model of restraint and precision in torpedo warfare. The boat's successful evasion of a punishing counterattack, during which over 100 depth charges were dropped, further confirmed the soundness of American submarine design and the effectiveness of its crew's damage control training. After the war, analysts compared American reports with surviving Japanese records and survivor testimonies.
Kossler had recorded 3 torpedo impacts, though several Japanese crewmen insisted that 4 had struck. Records from the Japanese escort vessels indicate that approximately 105 depth charges were deployed in retaliation, more than half detonating dangerously close to Cavalla. Debate still lingers over what exactly triggered the massive internal explosions that finally doomed Shōkaku, whether it was ignited aviation fuel, detonating ammunition stores, or a catastrophic combination of both. What is certain is that Cavalla's attack, combined with the concurrent sinking of Taiho by USS Albacore, eliminated 2 of Admiral Ozawa's 3 fleet carriers in a single day, effectively crippling Japan's carrier striking power. Amid the strategic implications, the human toll of Shōkaku's destruction remains sobering. The 1,272 sailors who perished were not faceless enemies. They were naval professionals, many of them young conscripts barely out of school, others seasoned sailors who had served aboard the carrier since her commissioning. They died performing their duty as they understood it, victims of a vast and merciless conflict. Among the fallen were numerous veteran officers whose experience would never be replaced. Each of their deaths represented an individual tragedy within the larger sweep of war. To this day, the exact resting place of Shōkaku remains a mystery. Unlike several other great warships of the Pacific that have been rediscovered by modern expeditions, her wreck has never been located. Somewhere in the depths of the Philippine Sea, her shattered hull rests, torn apart by the internal blasts that sealed her fate. For the families of the 1,272 men who went down with her, the absence of a known gravesite remains a quiet, enduring grief. Cavalla, by contrast, survived the war and continued to serve the U.S. Navy for another quarter-century, fulfilling training and research roles until her decommissioning in 1969. In 1982, she was declared a National Historic Landmark and preserved at Seawolf Park in Galveston, Texas. Today, visitors can pass through her narrow steel passageways, gaze through the same periscope Kossler used to sight Shōkaku, and stand in the control room where decisions of life and death were made in seconds. She endures as a physical monument to the courage, skill, and discipline of the silent service.
The consequences of Cavalla's triumph extended far beyond that single day in June. The annihilation of Japan's carrier air arm at the Battle of the Philippine Sea cleared the path for the recapture of the Philippines, the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and, ultimately, the planned assault on Japan itself. Strategically, the sinking of Shōkaku symbolized more than a military victory. It marked the irreversible shift of power in the Pacific and the beginning of the end for Japan's naval empire. Although the planned invasion of Japan never took place, rendered unnecessary by Tokyo's surrender after the atomic bombings, the naval dominance secured by the United States in June 1944 laid the foundation for every major operation that followed. That triumph, achieved through the hard-fought Battle of the Philippine Sea, ensured that the Allies could advance across the Pacific without serious threat from Japan's fleet. Within that broader campaign, the destruction of the carrier Shokaku by USS Cavalla stands as a striking microcosm of how the Pacific War evolved from Japan's early ascendancy to its irreversible decline. The Imperial Navy that had once appeared invincible during 1941 and 1942 was methodically dismantled over the ensuing years. American industrial production, technological innovation, and the relentless professionalism of its sailors and submariners gradually eroded what had seemed an unbeatable adversary. By mid-1944, the dynamic had reversed entirely. The hunters of Pearl Harbor had become the hunted, and the empire that had gambled everything on swift victory now faced the slow certainty of defeat. Even now, as new geopolitical frictions emerge in the same waters where those fleets once clashed, the lessons of the Philippine Sea retain their relevance. Submarine warfare proved the decisive equalizer. Accurate intelligence and reconnaissance became the foundation of success, and above all, technical superiority, whether in radar, sonar, or aircraft, determined the fate of empires. The story of Cavalla and Shōkaku remains a vivid reminder that command of the seas, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to regain. It also demonstrates how the outcome of immense wars can hinge on the skill and nerve of a single crew operating in the silent depths. On the morning of June 19, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched what it intended to be a decisive counteroffensive, a final attempt to repel American forces advancing toward the Mariana Islands. By nightfall, those ambitions had been crushed. Two of Japan's fleet carriers lay shattered on the seabed, and hundreds of its aircraft had been obliterated in the skies above the Philippine Sea. Amid the vast scope of that battle, the actions of just 72 men aboard Cavalla played a critical part in tipping the balance. Their precision attack demonstrated that in modern naval warfare, a single submarine could alter the strategic course of a campaign and, by extension, of history itself. Their success embodied the creed of the silent service: we sink them, regardless. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler would later describe the engagement as both the culmination of rigorous training and an instance of extraordinary timing. Years of preparation, discipline, and instinct had positioned Cavalla to seize a fleeting moment when opportunity aligned with readiness. Reflecting on that mission, Kossler echoed the sentiment expressed by Admiral Chester Nimitz that what is often labeled luck in war is usually the reward of meticulous preparation meeting circumstance. When that opportunity came, Cavalla was ready. Her torpedoes struck true, and within minutes, the pride of Japan's carrier force was doomed. From that day forward, the submarine that had left Groton, Connecticut only months earlier as an unremarkable Gato-class vessel carried a new legacy. Her name became etched in the annals of the U.S. Navy, not through ink or ceremony, but through the concussive signatures of the torpedoes that ended one of Japan's greatest warships. The sinking of Shōkaku remains one of the defining submarine victories of the Second World War, a moment when courage, preparation, and technology converged beneath the surface to shape the outcome of a global conflict.